How's it going, everybody? I want to talk damage today. It's a topic that keeps popping up every other week, but somehow everybody has resigned when it comes to hoping for actual big adjustments. It's a move here, a move there, and the pile of moves seems to be growing bigger and bigger. Combine this with getting hit more now since dodging is far less safe, eating 40 or 50 damage in an instant isn't all that uncommon. And call me crazy, but I don't enjoy getting blown the fuck up in a few seconds. We've talked enough about the dodge changes, so I'm not gonna mention those anymore. It's strictly damage numbers now. The last time we've seen a global damage decrease was with the core combat update. Multiple reasons were given for that. It basically boiled down to the following. A single mistake shouldn't decide a fight, meaning a wrong read, ripping out a third of your health bar, isn't a fun experience. You need to be allowed to make mistakes to get a proper read on your opponent and also condition them. Why would they adapt to any pattern if they die from 3 or 4 moves anyways? And I think we've gotten to such a point again. People have gotten used to faster attacks, have adjusted their playstyle, have invented new and better ganks. All exacerbated by this season's patch, people die a lot quicker now. And feeling like you cannot do anything about that is awful. But at the same time, it's also awful if you feel like somebody is just absorbing all your attacks and you don't put a dent into the health bar. You know, the exact feeling that you get when some twat with last stand survives an attack that they really shouldn't. That feeling needs to be avoided as well. I hope you get the hint there, Ubisoft. So, what do we know about damage numbers? They do follow quite a simple pattern really. The slower an attack, the more damage it does. And the same goes for attacks that are further into an attack chain. Openers do less than finisher attacks. Special attacks or specific follow-ups are usually assigned individual numbers, but still fall within reasonable limits from each other. But we still have big discrepancies here as well. Take a bash follow-up for example. Kyoshin or Black Prior in-chain bash confirm a light, and those do 14 or 16 damage respectively. Medjay on the other hand gets 9 damage after landing a bash. Those being different makes sense, since Medjay can go right back into it and has more chain pressure, whereas the other two need to use their special stance to keep going. I'm not defending the 9 damage here, I'm just saying that the difference makes sense. And you also have an unfaintable in-chain bash that does 24 damage, which is in line with the slower faintable ones. Once again, the context of the whole mix-up does play a vital role here, and it makes sense that Griffin does a lot more. So you cannot simply say the damage is too high here. That is my main point as so often lately. The big picture is important. You cannot just say, oh, 500 MS in chain bash? Well, they all need to do 14 damage. Well, that won't work. So it is completely understandable that higher damage numbers find their way in newer reworks. Valkyrie's shield tackle confirms a special light that deals 20 damage. My first reaction when I heard this was, well, that's too much. Then I changed my mind, realizing that the bash, when read correctly, can be punished quite harshly, so I was fine with it dealing a little more. And after a few weeks of experience in Valkyrie, I went back to my initial assumption of, that's way too much. The context here is that with more people around, it doesn't become all that punishable anymore, and the risk of GBing it in a 1v1 is a tad higher than I expected. For example, initially I would have never considered the range of the bash to be an issue. Quite the contrary, I personally really hate when attacks whiff in somebody's face. You think something will reach, but then it just falls flat. So even if most people will claim they always considered it too high with 20 damage, and I'm stupid for even considering it to not be, fact is, you can change your mind. That's allowed. Just like everybody claimed Medjay would be shit, despite a few, me, saying that staff mode is not to be underestimated. And look at it now. The broken part on Medjay is the staff mode and mostly the damage on it. Because while the rules that we looked at before, aka the slower an attack, the more damage it deals, well, those do make sense, they also don't scale infinitely. It doesn't really matter whether an attack is 1000 or 1100 MS, if it gets confirmed anyways, or hits externally at 766 MS for example, because they are angled appropriately. The damage number then outweighs all the drawbacks. But these are just two of the examples that have come up in the past year. 20 damage on Valkyrie's bash and 32 for heavy finishes on Medjay. A number by the way that you could find on Jeonhu as well, but was adjusted to 28. Very welcome and much needed change considering that Junhu's finishes are also unblockable. The other part is that both of these heroes, Junhu and Medjay, have feats that further enhance their damage. I don't want to get too much into the whole feat discussion because these passive ones aren't really the most egregious ones. But the problem is that not all game modes have feats, and adjusting damage numbers of the base attacks because of feats instead of the feats themselves fucks with other game modes. Let's take two identical moves on two different characters, but one of them has damage enhancing feats. A dual player won't be very understanding why one should do more damage than the other if there aren't any clear indicators within the base moveset that justify the difference. We could also get into the whole class discussion here that heavy characters should do more damage than high mobility assassins and so on. Take Shugo for example. I avoided talking about this in the other video. Shugoki has low damage. Low damage compared to the rest of the cast. So let me bring up something else and weave that in here. When we get big changes, Spaniard very often does these surveys to gauge the reaction of many of the more known players. And he did that with the CCU damage changes 2 years ago. And when I looked at that survey with the proposed damage numbers, or rather numbers that these players thought were okay, I'd consider these high damage now. The numbers we've gotten with the CCU were actually quite close to the ones in that survey. And after having played with them in the last 2 years, I think we could go even lower now. Meaning, Shugoki's quote-unquote low damage is actually something I like to see on more heroes. Which brings me back to the statement I made in the beginning of the video. Nobody enjoys getting blown the fuck up. Now, we once again walk the fine line of needing attacks that feel they have an impact, and not something that reminds you of a wet noodle. At the same time, fights should last long enough to allow for some mistakes, and even more importantly, allow for a comeback. But this is very subjective, so give me your input here. Is damage too high now? Is it just a select few moves? Or does it overall feel like you take a lot of damage for a single mistake? Are we even willing to try our lower damage? Or is it too much work to individually adjust many of these values again? There are a lot of small issues that need resolving when attempting something like this, and it's something that doesn't really add a lot of hype to the game. It's hard to get someone excited about doing less damage. If you're unlucky, their response is going to be, oh yeah, how fun, now I'm gonna get light spammed for even longer. Not only that, it's also hard for people to identify high damage if it doesn't come in a single attack. Like people have said for years that Peacekeepers somehow had low damage. Or when health swings need to be taken into consideration, be that with heals or with shields for example. People like to overlook that. Perception is important here. It's not just about the raw numbers. People hate drawn out fights that never end. And people hate dying instantly. Yet a happy medium is different for everybody. Well, I'll leave you with that. If you don't want to miss the next video about one of the biggest offenders in terms of damage, aka the Lawbringer rework, then please consider subscribing. I am sure it'll be a treat for everyone, including me. Alright, I hope the video was interesting. Thanks for watching. Laters everybody. Can I have help me? What? Oh.
Oh my god, he got your ass.